Your presenters tonight are Michael Herrick and John Lamprecht. So Michael Herrick is a longtime board member. He is the 2019 Golden Chanterelle Award winner, and he is the terror of Morels in about a 1,000-mile radius from Minnesota. And then John Lamprecht is past president, the current membership coordinator, and a seasoned mushroom veteran. And he's a great MC. So you guys are going to really love this presentation tonight. Yeah, without any further ado, here they are, Morel Mania.
All right, well, thank you, and welcome to Minnesota Mycological Society and our spring Morel presentation. Weather's shaping up nice, and it's looking good. All right, the fabulous Morel, Minnesota state mushroom, which a little anecdotal information was perpetrated, so to speak, by the Minnesota Mycological Society. They decided to have us as the Morel as the state fungi. Go ahead, John. All right, what do you need? Well, I think a lot of this is pretty much common sense. You know, some comfortable walking shoes or boots. Broken is preferable. Walking stick. I prefer a walking stick that's made out of an invasive, such as a buckthorn or ironwood is actually my favorite. A compass or GPS or both. Some type of non-plastic bag or basket. Plastic is a no-no because the mushrooms just perspire and I'll move closer to my microphone. Okay. All right. And I prefer canvas bags. A lot of people like mesh bags, and that's a whole nother discussion. A knife. I prefer a small, inexpensive fixed blade knife because hopefully you'll be into morels and you'll be needing to cut a lot of them. Water and snacks. I like an Nalgene, something that's, you know, refillable instead of just those throwaway plastics. And when you bring your bags, always bring an extra bag with so you can pick up some of the trash that you find in the woods. Just leave a little bit cleaner than when you found it. And tick prevention measures. This is a pretty big topic.
Why do you use binoculars?
Well, basically, binoculars is great for when you're trying to spot those dying elms that are maybe down in the valley or a few hundred yards apart, and kind of look for some high value targets. And, you know, this tick prevention measures, I just want to come to that for a second if I can't get on. But I strongly recommend treating your clothes with permethrin before you go out. Do it outside or in the garage and let them dry. Cats do have, if you have cats,
Let me stop sharing.
Problems with it. Here's one product, you know, the permethrin. This is Sawyer. You can buy it pretty much anywhere. Target, Walmart, etc. Treat your clothes. This is for only treating your clothes. Do not put this on your skin. And DEET is also your DEET is also your friend. I typically use a 40% DEET, but you can use the lower concentrations. The only difference between a 20% and a 40% is how long it lasts and the price of the bottle. Couple other things, as we mentioned, a compass is really helpful because when you're looking down, you kind of tend to lose track of where you are. GPS with spare batteries is a good idea too, because you can always mark where your car is. So when it's getting dark and you're getting tired, you can find your way back. And as far as, you know, a small fixed blade knife works great. And something that definitely I would recommend to everyone is having a good whistle. In fact, Fungi Magazine has done reviews on whistles. You want a good loud whistle, because from time to time, people do get turned around, people do get lost. So a compass and a whistle and water are definitely very important to you. And as far as water bottles, I just use Nalgene's. And something that might come in handy a little bit later in the season is a head net. These can be very useful when the mosquitoes or the black gnats come out, or black flies. And obviously some snacks. And what you want to do is you want to try some of these. Now, unfortunately, this is kind of getting empty, and I'm on my last package of my Morels from last year. So I'm ready to get on out there. And if you got any of your shiitake logs, the shiitakes are starting to pop. So that's good to get your mushroom fix. And let's move on. And, we're just getting through COVID, so let's avoid some other diseases that are out there. A lot of people aren't aware, but there are 16 tick-borne diseases in the United States. Obviously, Lyme disease is at the top. Ehrlichiosis is a particularly nasty one. Even some of these can make you allergic to red meat, which for some people isn't a big deal, but for others it's a problem. So please, have your permethrin and use your DEET. Go ahead, John. Well, after the hunt, log your daily activities, take care of your morels, and check for ticks. Taking care of your morels, that's a whole discussion in itself. With my morels, I like to gently wash them and then cut them in half and put them in a dehydrator if I'm not going to be eating them right away. The reason being, morels are hollow, and John will be going through some of the idea on that. And it's a great little hiding spot for ants, slugs, and beetles. And I just don't like the extra protein. They look prettier if you dry them whole, but sometimes you might end up with a little bit extra protein in them. And definitely check for ticks. The ticks are out already. So be aware. And those little guys, they're buggers to see. The wood ticks aren't the ones I'm worried about. It's those little guys, those deer ticks that are the problem. And, there's a number of ways to remove them, with having a tweezers or having, there's tick cards that you can carry with you. But definitely the sooner you get them removed, the better off you are. Go ahead, John.
Okay. So a small deer, deer ticks are tiny. So even a full adult, it's kind of hard to see. If you got a lot of freckles on your body like I do, tick checks are kind of tough. So you need a friend to help you. There you go. You want to comment on this?
Well, this is, there's a number of different blogs, morels.com or the Great Morel, and they have progression maps. How honest they are, I don't know, but it's interesting to watch where they are. I was looking at them yesterday, and there's actually a report from Northeast Minneapolis, obviously a microclimate area. And but still they're in southern Iowa and northern Missouri. So depending on the weather, I still think Minnesota prime time is probably going to be somewhere, if I could guess, would be somewhere between May 7th and May 15th. And I think Wisconsin should be popping within the next week.
Okay. All right, thanks. So a little bit more on when. You saw the progression map. The general rule of thumb is in Minnesota, up here in the upper Midwest, is anytime late April to early June. And the small gray morels, and you'll see some pictures of them, so it'll make a little bit more sense to those of you that aren't really sure what I'm referring to, but small gray morels appear first and often are really prolific. And then morels seem to get bigger as the season progresses, and eventually you'll find the Bigfoots, which are these things that have a foot the size of like a baseball bat handle with a large morel on top of it. They're really crumbly. To my way of thinking, they're not the ideal ones, but boy, you get a lot of bang for the buck. But they're much more crumbly and more delicate, actually. They tend to crumble apart in your bag or your basket. More care needs to be dealt with any of them. But the peak of the season is usually around mid-May. And a lot of it depends on soil temperatures and a lot of other things. I'm going to talk about some of that coming up here. The season is usually about between 3 to 5 weeks long. That's in a normal year. I mean, we've had seasons that have been 3 days long, it seems, if they even started at all. So it varies so terribly much, but somewhere between 3 to 5 weeks. So once they start, you could be picking into early June here in the metro area, and then it progresses north. When exactly, one of the big things to look for is when the lilacs begin to bloom or dandelions begin to go to seed. And there's a lot of variation in that depending on, on how much daylight, how much sunshine an area gets. But these are all things that are good indicators. If your lilacs aren't beginning to bloom, the general vicinity you're in is probably not going to have any morels. Another one that I always key in on is the jack in the pulpit. And I should have put a picture here of what a jack in the pulpit looks like. If you don't know, do a Google search on it later on. When the jack in the pulpit are actually starting to flower, then that's kind of a good indicator, because they tend to like similar soils also that morels tend to favor. Which tends to be slightly on the acidic side to just neutral soils. The one in the middle here that says oak leaves the size of a squirrel's ear, it depends on what kind of oak you're talking about. That's not a bur oak, because they get pretty big pretty quick. And a squirrel's ear, it depends on what kind of squirrel. But that's just one of the ones we pull out of the book so that we can actually chuckle at it a little bit. One of the ones that's really important, though, is soil temperature. And that's why, when lilacs begin to bloom, jack in the pulpit, and May apples is another thing, dandelion seeding, those all require the soil temperature to be progressing up through the 40s into the low 60s. But once we get into the low 50s, then that's when you can really pretty well predict that you're going to have some morels showing up, as long as they intend to come in the first place. And that's not always a given. Where traditional thought is to start on the warmer south-facing slopes. And as I shared with you, I was looking at at our hosta bed that's growing around our oak tree. And sure enough, the hostas that are facing the south are definitely growing much faster, progressing sooner. And if I were to take soil temperatures at all four corners, there probably is variation in the soil temperature to match the growth. Currently, I do see, as I walk through the woods, I do see ramps or the wild leeks that are starting to grow. It's still early in the season for those. Having dug a couple up, the bulb isn't very large yet, meaning it hasn't done much saving of nutrition in the bulb. But at any rate, so start on the warmer south facing slopes. And as you get toward the end of the season, then it's the north facing slopes. So you go south, west, east, north would be, you know, kind of more your go-to areas if you had to decide and cut down, if you had a limited amount of time. But basically, once you're in the woods, start checking the whole area. But you're going to start seeing some things. Chase the rain is an important thing as far as making sure that an area, Jane mentioned that the Chicago area has been particularly dry. I'm not sure what the weather really would be like in the northern Missouri and Iowa regions, because they had unusual snow very recently. But once that melts, that goes right into the ground, and actually the Morels like that moisture really well. They don't like the cold that much. But one of the best areas to be looking in the upper Midwest is recently dead or close to dead elm trees. Those are generally the best. My experience is more recently dead ones that are close to dead. It's worth taking notice of them to make sure you come back to that same spot next year, because generally speaking, the Morels seem to fruit the best once a tree has died and is just starting to slough its bark. So this is what, you know, so you're going to have to learn your trees a little bit, tree identification. But the classic shape for an elm tree is this inverted vase. That's a classic shape for an elm tree. And during the summertime, when everything should be leafed out, that's a good time to be scouting for the following year, because if you notice that there's this vase-shaped tree that doesn't have any leaves on it at all, and it's still got almost all of its bark on, if not all of it, kind of, you know, make sure you know where that is, or get to know the farmer that owns that land, get permission to come hunt it, or if it's in a park, don't put tape on it, because if Mike finds that tape, he just knows where your spots are, and he will come and pick all of your Morels and then steal your tape. So anyhow, just remember where the spots are. That's where a GPS really comes in handy, because you can actually mark waypoints on your GPS for places to come back to. That works for summertime and fall mushroom hunting just as well as Morel time. Now here's really, you know, this is sad, because I mean, this elm tree is dead, but in a lot of ways, you know, we call it a beautiful dead elm tree. It's sloughing its bark. It's just off the side of the road, and it's a gravel road, so it probably doesn't get that terribly much traffic. Hoping that, you know, there's not any sprays that are being placed in that area. And with the bark coming off, you know, that's a good sign that it probably will have some things to look at. One of the things that you'll notice, and I'll talk about it as I get down to the last few slides of my presentation, is some of the other mushrooms that we talk about. Tim already did talk about a pheasant back mushroom, or dryad saddle is another name for it. It gets its name because it looks like a pheasant's back. They typically will grow on elm trees that are really, really, really dead. So usually ones that are past any production for Morels. Okay, where else? There's a lot of places where you can find Morels. You may find them in your yard, or actually in the edge of your garden, depending on what used to be there. Morels are feeding on the nutrition left over under the ground. Oftentimes you'll find them under diseased oaks, poplars, cottonwoods, and white ash. In sumac, especially dead sumac, or really old, overly mature sumac. Old apple orchards are another spot that typically people will find morels in, especially out east. However, one of the concerns about old apple orchards is oftentimes when the apple orchard was being utilized for producing apples as a fruiting crop, there was arsenic being used as a pest repellent. And that arsenic stays in the soil. And the bad news is mushrooms bring up many of those heavy metals and actually hold those in their flesh. So you probably don't want to be hunting in old apple orchards unless you know that they've never used that kind of stuff. Yep. So river bottoms and floodplains. It was mentioned that actually in one of the Mississippi River floodplain areas, there was a fruiting of morels already seen in the metro area, in the North Metro. One of the difficulties about that, though, is oftentimes those areas are really sandy, and as when you go to eat a morel, morels are difficult. Michael mentioned that he will do some washing of them before he actually starts to dry them or, put them away, or preserve them and utilize them. If you got too much sand in your morels, it's very, very difficult because there's pitch and ridges. You get sand in there, it's tough to get that out. And gritty sand is not good for much of anything except for your dentist. Let's see, disturbed ground. It seems that morels are particularly fond of disturbed ground. So if there's an area that is being developed, but the adjacent area still has standing trees and elms and that kind of cover still intact, the pounding of the earth movers and the other heavy equipment that they use, oftentimes that disturbed ground will be a catalyst for fruiting over in that wooded area that's adjacent to it. Along railroad tracks is another area. One of the problems with along railroad tracks that I'm concerned about is that railroad tracks, the creosote from the railroad ties is not good. You don't really want that. Landscape morels, that's more of a West Coast thing. However, there are people that are trying to cultivate using landscape morels. There was a recent NAMA presentation about landscape, or about trying to grow your morels, and basically it's an expensive prospect and the returns are not necessarily very good, but there are landscape morels that actually are much more saprobic. In other words, they're decomposers to a larger extent and much more aggressive. So some of those varieties can be, can possibly come up. I mentioned that along your, in some of your gardens, you may have some mushrooms or morels that will pop up. And those are not necessarily landscape morels. It's probably because there used to be an old tree or two that were underneath, or the root systems actually extend a long ways away from a tree that used to be very close by. And so that might be some leftovers, a few coming. Conifers and old aspens harbor black morels, and I'll show you what a black morel is here shortly. Burn sites get a lot of press, but they're much more prevalent out west. We really don't have them in this part of the Midwest. However, in the upper peninsula of Michigan, there is some evidence that there are some burn site morels that can be found. However, those morels tend to be kind of ash tasting. So I would probably not hunt them so much, but out west, that's you can find gigantic fruitings. Places, trying to find a place to hunt. Check out the Minnesota Atlas and Gazetteers, any of the maps, DNR websites, park and forest maps. you're looking in, if you use Google, then put it on the satellite and see what kind of tree cover is in a particular area. I already mentioned that scouting for good trees in the summer, as you're walking through the woods and you notice that trees that should be leafed out are not leafed out right now, if it's got that classic vase shape and that tighter bark that makes it look like an elm tree, take note of it, possibly mark it on your GPS. On the bottom one, it says knock on doors. And then one of the important parts of that is make sure you get permission before you hunt on somebody's property. Don't take anything for granted. There are also some parks in the metro area that is off limits for picking any kind of natural thing. Berries, mushrooms, plants, other stuff. There are some of the Dakota County regional parks are very limited for that. The Three Rivers Park District has a lot of regulations. So make sure you check the regulations. But if you can find private property, most of the land in Minnesota is privately held rather than public. So knock on doors. Not everybody's a mushroom hunter. So if you see some good trees or some good wooded area, try to get some permission. And those will be areas that you don't really have a lot of competition when you're out hunting. So that's a good thing. Morel vision. Hopefully I'll show you a couple of pictures of this, but assume the morel hunter's crouch. In other words, if you're not very flexible, it gets tougher and tougher. Trust me, I know this very well, because you need to really kind of get down low to be looking for mushrooms. You need to visualize it and look for the shape. One of the things I was hoping Michael was going to show is one of his walking sticks that maybe has a morel on the top, because people will look at that and they'll go, oh yeah, that's the shape I'm looking for. Try to remember why they're looking and what they are looking for in particular. Morels are usually very well camouflaged, and except for once they get to be like in the Bigfoot stage, and then it's like, how can you miss them? But you still do. And then finally I said, pick them without stepping on them, because when you see one, you get so excited, you run almost over there and you forget to look where you're stepping, because you're probably going to be stepping on others, because where there's one, there's probably more. This is sort of like getting down and dirty, the morel hunter's crouch, getting down low. So you can actually see the morel. They're tan, the leaves are tan. There's a lot of leaf duff on the ground. So at times it can be very difficult to pick them out. Like, see how tough this one would be to see? Unless you really get right down there, you won't be able to see that there is actually a morel underneath there. Some of them actually stand out very nicely against their background. So look for neighbors. If you see one, there's probably more. Look at different angles, get on your hands and knees. If your knees aren't dirty when you're out morel hunting, you probably didn't work hard enough. Your feet are going to be a little tired, and your knees are probably going to be dirty. So as you're looking, make sure you look for all of them. There's actually 3 morels in this picture. There's a little smaller one, just hiding near the left-hand one, a much smaller one. Questions will probably be popping about how small is too small to pick. Well, we'll show you the smallest morel any of us have ever picked, to our knowledge, in one of the pictures. But generally speaking, you want to actually let the morels mature to the point where they're probably starting to spawn. They have so many spores that come out of a morel. There'll be plenty, but you need to let it actually get started a little bit. It's easy to say, it's kind of hard to carry out, but let them shoot their spores a little bit. But I like morels in about these sizes, which is going to be somewhere around 2.5, 3 inches in height. You notice the gray coloration on these particular morels. So these would be at least the top two. There's one at the top and then another one just below it that's much larger. Those are both kind of gray. And then there's another one down below that's a little bit more yellow. They're all the same morel. It's just they get variations in color. And many of the earlier ones tend to be more on the gray side. The pits and ridges will be a little bit tighter. And as they start to expand, they tend to get that more yellowish coloration like these do. The bottom one is more strikingly light colored. A lot of it has to do with how much sunlight, how much shade. You'll notice that as you get into other mushroom hunts, is that there'll be variation in color for the fruit bodies as well. Now it's time to get a little bit scientific. Now that you've seen some pictures, first of all, what is a morel? Well, the kingdom is fungi, and fungi has only been a kingdom of its own since 1969. Before it was in the plant kingdom, and then somebody brilliant actually realized that these aren't plants. They don't do the same things. In fact, the truth of the matter is that fungi actually share more commonalities with the animal kingdom than they do with the plant kingdom, as far as their structure and some other things go. The particular division for these guys is Ascomycota, and Basidium micata is the other ones. Those are the more typical guild mushrooms that we're familiar with. The Ascomycota, surprisingly, is actually a much, much larger group than the typical mushrooms that we think of, because Ascomycota actually includes a bunch of other small and smaller fungi that we don't typically think of as mushrooms. But they're also called the sac fungi because of how they bear their spores, and I'll show you that in a picture. This is all the other stuff. It gets down to family Morcheliaceae, genus Morchella, and then the species names have changed. DNA has really done incredible things. I'm not going to say positive or negative, but whereas it used to be Morchella esculenta was the name for the typical yellow morel that everybody knows and loves. And in fact, when it was decided that it would be our state fungus, that's what it was. But actually, that name has been changed to Americana because the DNA has shown that it does not. It's related, but it is not the same thing as Morchella esculenta, which is actually a European species. The black morel is Angusticeps, and Punctipes is the half-free morel. I'm going to show you that in a second. So this is a typical cup fungus. These are some of the ones that actually you'll see in the wild pretty soon. Even as you're morel hunting, you'll see some of these. But the ascocarp and the asci are actually in a sac, and then all of a sudden it'll open up and it'll shoot these things out into the air. Most of the cup fungus actually are spore shooters, and actually will expel their spores with some degree of force, not necessarily relying as much on gravity, water, and other things, raindrops, and other things to disperse their spores. So, the spore bags that were widely being sold for morel hunting, where it showed this cute little picture of you walking through the woods with your morels and it's dropping the spores behind you, and you're like Johnny Appleseed, sprinkling spores on the forest floor. That's not very accurate. Actually, what they were doing is they actually was shooting them out. So if you carry them in a basket or something else that's open, they're going to be shooting their spores around and doing a very nice job of distributing the spores without you carrying them in a basket or in a bag that may have things that will rub the pits and the ridges right off of your morels. Okay, this is what a half-free morel looks like. Looks a little bit different. It's like a more of a round ball on top of a stem. Punctipes, it actually gets its name because on the stem there is like, this doesn't really show it so good in this view, but however, there's little dots, little raised areas on the outside of the stem that are called punctations, and that's where it gets its name. However, here's one of the main identifying features of all morels, all Morchella, is that they have a hollow stem. This one, though, the punctipes or the half-free morel, gets its name because the cap is only connected halfway up or halfway into the cap. You can see that very clearly. It's free along the sides, halfway down. However, it is fully hollow on the inside. These are an edible and in some ways an early season morel. They're actually technically in the black morel grouping. Typically, I will find these near old black cherry trees, but they're often, you'll find them randomly in areas where there's no elms or anything, but you'll find other types of trees. But the hollow on the inside is the important thing. These are called half-free because they're only halfway connected. Your typical Morchella americana or yellow morel, like these, you see that they're totally connected. That cap is totally connected to the rest of, all the way down the cap to the stem. Part of the stem is not connected to the cap, of course, but they're totally hollow on the inside as well. Pits and ridges, hollow body. And as Michael pointed out, you need to cut these things in half to remove things like dirt, grit, sand, other ants, other things that will be inside, because they will oftentimes, there may be some holes in the side where mud will actually splash up inside. You just clean them out. This is what a black morel looks like. And it gets its name from, if you notice, let me go back. On these guys, if you look on the, this is a better one. If you look, these are yellow morels or generally yellow morels. But you notice that the pits and the ridges in these guys are very light, or the ridges are light color and the pits actually are somewhat darker. So the ridges tend to be very, very light in the white and yellow morels. When you get to the black morels have darker ridges. That's where it gets the name black morel. They're not really that black in color. They tend to be a little bit more conical in shape. But again, there's a lot of variation. And these will typically grow more closely related to some of the conifers or some of the other aspens and other things. One of the other things about the black morels is you notice at the stem connection to the cap, there's actually usually a slight depression. It's still fully connected, but there's a slight depression. And if you cut one of these in half, they'll be fully hollow all the way through. But you notice the conical nature of the growth on these guys, much more dunce cap like or conical. Now there are verpas which are not morels, they're not Morchella. They're rather closely related and often called early morels or thimbleheads. We do have some of these that grow here during the morel hunts, the actual morel hunt contests in other states. Finding these actually does count towards your morel count. These are conicas. We have found these, but if you notice that in the stem, there's actually a pithy filling inside of them. It's not hollow on the inside. There's actually like a pithy, cottony filling in it. And the cap is connected only at the very, very top. It looks like a thimble sitting on top. That's hence the name thimble heads. It looks like a thimble sitting on top of a straw. And we have found these in southeast Minnesota. Other people have probably found them in a lot of other places, but I've actually collected them. Never eaten them. Don't know. Can't really bring myself to it. But again, they do get counted in the Morel counts. And this one is Verpa bohemica, which looks a lot more like your typical Morel, actually more like a half free. But again, the cap is only connected at the very top, and those are folds only. They're not pits and ridges. They're generally speaking primarily folds at the top of the cap, and the stem will be filled with that cottony pith. Now, here we go. We're going to talk about Gyromitra. There are some of the false Morels. Gyromitra are believed to be toxic. They do contain a carcinogenic substance, monomethyl hydrazine, that is believed to be carcinogenic, and it's cumulative. In other words, a systemic thing that will build up in your flesh. You can eat it for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden you eat one more and it's too much. But these are often called false Morels. Gyromitra esculenta, and actually the esculenta means edible, and they are not. They're actually we teach them as that they are poisonous. There are people, again, that do eat them, but many people that do that, they will boil them in water, throw the water away, boil them, throw the water away, boil them, throw the water away multiple times to try to leach out that chemical that's so harmful. They can be very, very heavy. If you notice the cross section on the one in the left, they have many chambers and pits, and you find a couple of these and there's a lot of weight to them. So they're very, very meaty. And here's a couple of other pictures of other versions of them. We do have, I think there's 3 or 4 versions of them that we can find here in Minnesota. This is the Brunea, which is also called elephant ears. You can see kind of where it gets its name. But then again, see the cross section. It's got a lot of chambers. And then there are Havelas, which is another sort of false Morel. They have kind of a Morel look to them, but they're actually believed to be more closely related to truffles, even though they grow above ground. Typically, you'll find these in the fall. So one of the things that I didn't mention fully, but we did mention when the typical season in Minnesota is, that Morels are a springtime mushroom. If you find what you think is a Morel any other time of the year, pretty much in the upper Midwest, you've either found a stinkhorn or a Helvela or something else. You haven't found a Morel, because Morels are limited to the springtime here in the upper Midwest. All right, Morels are various in shape, size, shades, colors, and all the yellow Morels, I mean, it runs a range of colors. They're sort of like snowflakes. Each one is unique. So there's a lot of different variations in colors and shapes. So don't be totally surprised. So I'm going to run through a bunch of different pictures of ones. Some of them are very, very light colored. Like I say, this one looks really particularly clean, nicely mature, a good specimen to pick by all means, probably has spored some, may still have some spores. I have had a box of spores, or a box of mushrooms actually spore in my kitchen. watching it in the sunlight as it's puffing out what looks like a little smoke out of the mushroom. So it's kind of cool. I wish I would have done a YouTuber on it or something, but it caught me so much by surprise. This is more on the gray side. Notice the pits and ridges are not as deep or spread out. This would be a little less mature specimen. It might have spored some, but probably not as much. We can talk and answer questions about, well, should I pick a mushroom like this or not? Depends on whether you think somebody is going to come right behind you and pick it themselves and what you want to do about it. I don't know. It's a tough issue. This one, again, a little bit more mature, and you notice the pits and ridges well defined. This one's kind of bent over at the top. You'll see that for a number of different reasons. This is actually on the Bigfoot side. This is a much larger mushroom, and you notice the stem is much thicker or much larger. And this would be one that would be called a Bigfoot because the stem is particularly large, especially down to the base. This is a gray. Oops, there's another one. This one's a yellow. And notice variations in how deep the ridges, how well defined they are, how well defined the pits are. It's not as gigantically uniform. I mean, there's a lot, and some of these variations undoubtedly are probably because there are some DNA differences. Some of the studies are actually suggesting there may be several dozens of, in fact, I think it was the latest presentation we saw, it was in the 60s of the number of different species there actually are of morels found in Minnesota. I mean, not in Minnesota, but in the United States. Another one, so you see the variation, but again, very distinctive pits and ridges on a light colored stem, and they're totally hollow on the inside. This one looks somewhere in between all the other ones. A lot of variation. Do some of them taste better than others? I can't tell you. I throw them all together a lot of times and eat them all together. Black ones will taste just as good. These are more conical, and the black morels. And sometimes they do grow two heads or in clusters. So it's a lot of fun when you find morels in a cluster like this, because you get a lot more when you're harvesting in little groups like this and other clusters. Nice little groupings. A lot of times they're associated with moss, and it's really much more striking when you find them in moss. They're a little bit easier to see. And again, here's a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You notice the one that's really almost dead middle. It's got like a mildew on it. That would be an area that you would actually clean out with your knife. You would just cut around that and discard that. Wouldn't keep that and take that back after you checked out the rest of your mushroom. That's why it's important when you cut them in half too, you look for other areas that might have discoloration, deep discolorations, and or if there's bad smells to them or anything. So you would get rid of those. Here's a decent haul. You notice all the way across, there's some variation in color. You also see on the far right hand near middle, there's one with a very, very black top. That's usually, we attribute that to a mushroom that was exposed. The top of it was much more exposed to the element, whether it be sunlight or might have gotten a little frostbite while it had popped up. It might have got a touch of frostbite on top of it, but that'd be in an area you would typically clean off. And again, spreading them out, being a show off, but that's okay. That's what we do. And again, you see some variations. You see some coloration, discolorations. If you see deep rusty areas, those would be areas you would clean out, or the blackened areas you would clean out. You can also see up inside of some of these hollow guys. You can see that all of them are hollow, but you can also see, if you look, especially the one just off to the left in the middle, you can see like a black area inside of the hollow stem. That looks a lot like it's got a lot of mud and dirt in it. So you'd have to spend a little bit of extra time cleaning that. That's why if you slice them in half lengthwise, first of all, you can verify that they're a morel because they'll be hollow, and then you can clean out all the stuff and the junk that's in there. This is sort of getting into, different size variations. Morels can grow quite large. I mean, that's a full-size 7-Up can. So you've got some morels that are in the 8, 9, 10-inch range. And, basically, one of the best things about morels is cooking them. I prefer actually just frying them in butter. I've tried them in olive oil, and olive oil just doesn't do them justice. If you use a quality olive oil, perhaps, but butter. Butter is one of the best things. How do you deal with morels once you find a bunch of them? One of the best things to do, you just dry them. You can string them and hang them up in a sunny place, such as a south-facing window, as long as it's inside. You can air dry on screens or in a mesh, or use a dehydrator, actually. So use a Garden Master or one of the commercial Nesco dehydrators or one of the others on a low temperature. You don't want to do it on a very high temperature because you can discolor your morels a great deal. They don't look as good, probably cause a little bit of burning to the morel. You don't want to leave them outside overnight because critters will come and get them. That could be a problem. Let's see. Every time I move this thing, it forgets where I'm at. Okay. So a lot of people, if they're going to be out in the wild for a while, they will actually bring a screen, like screening material or some kind of a mesh material. And all the pots and the logs and stuff like that are to keep them up off the ground, because you do want airflow underneath all around if you're going to be drying your morels. You want to make sure that they have airflow totally all the way around them and dry them down as much as you can. Get as much of the moisture out of them as possible. That's a little bit better picture showing that you need them up off the ground so that they're able to air dry. And there is a picture of Ron Spinoza and the tiniest morel that we've ever found when we were out on a foray. And actually it was picked more because of the novelty nature of it. That would be an ideal one you'd leave behind and just say, well, somebody else is going to find that morel after it gets bigger. If it does. I've seen some morels that size that I left and came back to check several days later, and basically they just withered up and turned to nothing. They weren't cut because I know it was an area that no one else would have been in. They just kind of withered up and disappeared, unless some critter got them or something, but they didn't leave anything behind. And then you'll get some that, you'll see pictures of things like this, giant, enormous morels, that size. They tend to get kind of crumbly as they get this big, but that would definitely be a Bigfoot. And then this one actually was a widely published picture. Somebody found this actually in their window well in St. Paul, or one like this in a window well in St. Paul. Why it was growing in the window well, nobody really knows, except for there must have been some kind of nutrition there that the morel wanted to grow out of. That's an enormous morel. I imagine what it tastes, or what it weighs. So, also, okay, so tons of information. One thing I'm going to mention, and I don't want to skip this, is that, in fact, there were some postings online about morel mushrooms and certain recipes that they had, and people were making morel ice cream and a bunch of other things and using morels fresh right on a salad. Morels must be cooked. In fact, almost virtually every wild mushroom needs to be cooked before you eat it. Yeah, it's not like the salad bar. And there's a lot of good reasons, but one of the primary reasons is because the structure of a mushroom is primarily chitinous, and we do not digest chitin very well. The cooking process helps to break down the chitin, so we're able to digest it a lot better. Also, most mushrooms have some degree of toxins in them. Now, the word toxin is taken like, oh, poison. No, toxin just means things that are not natural in the quantities they're in, natural to our bodies. So it's a little bit foreign to our bodies. So the cooking process will make them more palatable and useful for our digestive tracts. Also removing some of the toxins. But then there's some toxins that simply, no matter how much you cook them, how much you boil them, how much you do anything to them, those toxins will never go away because it's buried into the flesh. And those are the amanitas and some of the other ones that will actually, some of the toxins, there's 7 or 8 specific toxins that, and about half of those are actually deadly, have caused deaths. But you must cook your mushrooms. All right. You must cook your mushrooms. Some of the other spring mushrooms that you may find while we're out and about. So all is not lost if you don't find any morels. Oyster mushrooms can be found. They're large, white, they're a gilled mushroom. The gills totally descend the stem. In most cases, they sort of have a nice anise smell to them, unless they're overly mature and actually on the way to being too mature, and then they won't smell very good at all. And I wouldn't take them home if that was the case. So if they have a pleasant smell, this is one. And any gilled mushroom, actually, you need to make sure that you're out and about with somebody who actually knows what they're doing, so they can help you to verify this identification. They're a gilled mushroom. It comes down the stem. They grow on a lot of different kinds of wood. They're white, would have a white spore print, white to lilac spore print, a very pleasant smell. And they taste good like the oyster mushrooms you can buy in the grocery store. But I would make sure actually that somebody helps you identify them if it's the first time you've ever seen these. And then still be very, very careful. And anytime you eat a mushroom for the very first time and you've never had that particular type of mushroom before, you should only eat a small amount to make sure that you're okay with it, that your digestive system is good with it, before you would eat a full meal. And then always keep some, maybe a couple on hand for, if you had to make a visit to the emergency room or poison control. Okay, that being said, because a couple of other mushrooms that we'll find, there's entaloma, there's pheasant back. I don't have a good picture of pheasant back, but when we go on forays, by all means, if you have a mushroom that you need somebody to help identify, the Minnesota Mycological Society, actually check out our website. Ron Spinoza, myself, a number of other individuals are willing to look at pictures and help you to identify them, but you want to give as much detail in the pictures as possible. The mushrooms on the far left-hand side are called velvet foot, or Flammulina volutipes. It's a wild form of the gnocchi mushroom, which is actually the ones that are on the far right-hand side. Those would be the ones you'd see in the Asian market, for instance. But in the wild, they have this nice caramel color, and they get the name velvet foot because on the stem, you'll look at the very, very top one where you can see the gills. You also see the blackened stem. That's very fuzzy or velvety. They grow on dead trees in clusters. However, the bad news is the one in the middle is also grows on clusters on trees, sort of caramel color, would have a different color spore print and other things, and they're deadly Galerina. And Galerina, this type of Galerina actually has amatoxin in it. So not all amatoxin comes from an amanita. Amatoxin is the worst poison we have in the mushroom kingdom. In my opinion, it causes kidney, liver failure. There's really no standard treatment for it, except for milk thistle extract is being used to treat some of it, especially, and has shown some promise in Europe where it's much more of a problem, and is starting to catch on a little bit here in the United States if somebody actually has an amanita poisoning. But deadly Galerina, they tend to be a little bit smaller. These pictures are not shown very good on scale. They tend to be about quarter size at the largest, but they will have a brown cap. They grow in clusters on wood, similar to velvet foot. So again, you need to check your mushrooms. Check every mushroom before you even think about eating it. You need to check every single mushroom. And you would do a spore print. I'm going to be doing a presentation on how to do a spore print, but basically you cut the stem off, set the cap with the gills down on a piece of paper, and cover it and leave it there for some period of time. Come an hour, 2 hours, come back afterwards, remove that cover, and then remove the mushroom and see what the color of the spore deposit is. If it's a Galerina, it'll have a brownish, rusty colored spore print. If it's something else, if it's a different color, then it may be something else. Spore print doesn't lie, but it isn't the only identifying feature. There's a lot of things, and any gilled mushroom tends to be much harder to identify. That's why morels are so simple. That's why they're so popular. That's why so many people hunt them, because they're very distinctive. Okay, there is a good picture here of pheasant back. This is the pheasant back mushroom that Tim was talking about. These will grow typically on old elm trees and other dead trees that have pretty much lost their bark. They're one of the final decomposers for these, for the standing trees until they fall over. You'll find them on stems. You'll find them in little bits and pieces, or in smaller fruitings, fruit bodies, and then you'll find them in large fruit bodies that are 10 to 12 inches around. It is technically an edible mushroom. Some people have been able to enjoy this mushroom. If you get a very, very young and tender specimen, you can cube it up and fry it, cook it nice and slow. One of our members actually will pickle this, and it's like pickling. It's like pickled watermelon rind, is what she says. Which I don't know. I'm not a fan of watermelon rind, but that's okay. It's a possible use for this particular mushroom, and some people have actually been able to enjoy it, like I say, by eating this. It has very, very large pores. This is a polypore, meaning many pores. Polyporous squamosus. It has large pores. It's very simple to see that this has got pores underneath the lower surface of the mushroom. The top of the mushroom, that's where it gets its name pheasant back, because it does have some of the coloration of a pheasant's feathers. And again, that's one of the spring mushrooms we may find And you can find it in actually large quantities and large numbers. So it's one you can possibly experiment with. But again, you should have somebody verify the identification for you, or make sure you find it actually in your own manuals. And this is ideally what we're looking for. This is a field of dreams. This is one of the, this is what we hope for. You'll notice the tree that's just off to the upper left on this picture appears to not have any bark. Now, is this the tree that was the host to this fruiting? Don't necessarily think so. Is probably one very close to it. The one in the upper left probably died some time ago, and its neighbor or part of its family was adjacent to it, and it probably recently died. And so in response, the mycelium put up all of these fruit bodies, and that's a lot of good things.